I'm welcoming all those who are tuning in from around the world and outside our immediate panelists. This is day one of a 3-day series. Today we are more specifically talking about the pandemic dimensions with a focus on influenza aspects. I would like to start with maybe each of the panelists giving a short introductions about themselves, and then we can start with a number of questions that we will run through, and the audience who are participating can then also post questions that we will try to respond to. So perhaps first, Mark, could you give a short introduction of your background in this field?
I'm really glad to be here. My name's Mark Jitt, and I'm a professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And most of my work has been around mathematical modeling and health economic analyses of vaccines, so including influenza, seasonal and pandemic, but including more recently COVID-19 vaccines and so forth. Less on the financing side, more looking at cost effectiveness of vaccines within countries, but also looking at sort of optimal global allocation from the perspective of efficiency and equity. So thanks, glad to be here.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Mark. Now, Rodrigo, could you maybe share with us a little bit your background in the financing focus that we have in this session today?
Yeah, thank you so much.
I got involved in this field.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Rodrigo Salvado. I'm the Deputy Director of International Development Finance at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and I have been working closely with, we lead the work on vaccine financing from the foundation, and we have been engaged with COVAX right from the beginning on the design of the mechanisms for funding the pandemic, and now we are looking really closely to what is going to be the architecture that is needed right for 2022 and 2023, and still fighting with the gaps, as we will see in a minute, of 2021. Glad to be here.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Rodrigo. Now, Peter, you have a long-standing history in this field, including the financing, so maybe you could share a little bit your background and how you came to this particular role.
Well, thanks, Ark. And as you say, I come from the finance world rather than the medical or scientific world, having run a large bank in my previous existence. But right now, I'm running the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. And the Global Fund is a financing mechanism, and it's probably the largest, it is the largest health-focused global financing multilateral mechanism there is. We are spending about $4.5 billion this year on HIV, TB, and malaria. And on top of that, the best part of another $4 billion in helping countries respond to the COVID crisis. The one wrinkle with respect to this discussion is that none of this is for vaccines. The role of the Global Fund is to fund all the other aspects of the response, with COVAX being the vehicle for vaccines. But obviously, as part of the ACT Accelerator, under which COVAX falls, I'm very much involved in the response as a whole.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Peter. As to myself, I am originally from the Netherlands, a small country in Western Europe. The last 40 years I've lived in the United States, where I worked for the World Bank and oversaw most of its research in the health field and related areas in the social sectors. So I think with that, we can start our discussion. I think we have more or less 45 minutes or similar. So we have a few guiding questions. And let me run through them first, and then maybe I'll pick one or two and ask for a response from our panelists. In the first place, many of us are concerned with the issue of the cost benefit of the vaccinations in the current pandemic by country. Many countries have different approaches of how to prioritize which group in age, for example, socioeconomic specifications, or even by sector, in health sector or essential workers, etc. How do we look at that cost-benefit question, for example, for any kind of a future pandemic that might emerge from influenza variation? A second concern that many of us have in including the vaccine and equity issue world is how do we ensure sufficient access of vaccines to lower and middle income countries and neutralize the power of wealth, if you like, in a way that it becomes equitable for those in greatest needs. And that actually then leads to a more detailed issue. Even if one were to find a way, how does one ensure the proper supplies, whether they be vaccines or therapeutics in the future, or diagnostics or protective equipment, to those countries and populations in greatest needs, considering the trade and financial and other barriers that we have witnessed over the last year in the current pandemic. And then finally, which would apply to all of these earlier questions, how do we better incentivize constituencies, countries, populations, certain groups, active industry, to participate and commit more to a multilateral approach in terms of pandemics? So those are kind of, to start with, 4 perspectives that are interlinked, of course. And perhaps, Rodrigo, I could start with you to maybe pick one of these or all of them, or however you want to deal with it. Please.
Very simple questions on that. So I'm glad that we have 45 minutes. So let me start with the second one, actually, right, on the sufficient finance. And I'm going to put something out there. You know, from the very beginning, we have been trying to solve this issue from financing, you know, very early on. And my sense is probably not the major issue that we found is not the volume of finance, but the type of financing that we needed to put together. So I think even countries, right, what we got really right from the start was that we really needed better risk diversification, right? What we really needed at the beginning, and even when we were thinking about COVAX at the very early, the key thing was how we're going to get money, you know, for investing in something that we don't know if they're going to get approval, right? How we're going to actually do that and make sure that those who cannot really afford that risk, which was the low-income countries, you know, can get some sort of that risk coverage from, you know, the ones that can do it. So at the very early beginning, COVAX was meant to be a risk diversification mechanism, right? Trying to get contributions for high-income countries and actually taking that to pay, you know, for that risk financing to actually cover the low-income countries. That didn't happen, right? It took way too long to actually pull that funding, right, for risk. By the time that happened, that was already back in the line, right? And those that actually could actually afford that risk taking, those who actually can actually say, I'm willing to pay and I don't mind losing money if these things don't get to completion, were there. So I think that, I mean, and also if you see even now, right, countries were willing and can access some financing. Again, you can go to a multilateral development bank and say, I have the money, I have the procurement here, right? And the NDBs are going to give you the money. What NDBs are not going to, multilateral development banks are not telling you is, I'm going to give you the money, right? And I'm going to cover the risk to go you to make the purchases, right? And if those go through, I'm going to be covering you. So I think that the main issue here that we find here really in terms of financing is really that risk diversification. I think that the other point, like even now we're struggling with that. Even now we have, you know, what is very important also is to have like the pooling mechanisms, the pre-financing side. I don't think that, you know, the main thing that the countries are struggling with is that it's very hard to know what they are going to get at what price they are going to get it, right? So the multilateral mechanisms have been, trying and struggling to make those deals and say, you know what, we really want to deliver vaccines to the low-income countries. But the problem is that now we cannot assure you, right, where those deliveries are going to happen, at what price, because precisely that's the thing of the multilateral. So countries in that situation, right, saying, well, if I don't know what I'm going to be getting for the multilateral funds, I had to actually go and cover myself, right? So we also, the second part of here, which is not really the volume of financing, one is risk identification, the other one is geopolitics, right? We forgot at the beginning that at the end of the day, this was going to be a dynamic here, the geopolitical dynamic that was going to be at play. So countries were going to be forced, right, to get those vaccines or to try to get those deals, right? And if the multilateral system was not delivering for them, they will have to go somewhere else. So I want to, again, for me, the main point here is it's not so much about the volume, but the type of financing that we need to put together. I think that, the thing is looking ahead, right? I think that we have like good lessons and they actually are good examples of what could happen. For example, what we have right now is what we really need is one sort of aggregated, mechanism that can have different type of financing for different needs, right? We should have a mechanism that provides the sort of the grant financing that COVAX is doing for the low-income countries to actually pay for it. We should probably have the same amount of financing, right? But also at like a little bit more like higher prices, right? So countries can actually afford those. The ones that can afford some loans to purchase it can actually do it. But what is important here is to actually have that sort in an aggregated manner, more complementary. Right now, we have many things that are disaggregated, where we're too fragmented. We have multilateral development banks on one side, we have COVAX on the other side, bilateral, financing happening on the other. I think that we can do better if we actually are like making this more aggregated, if we actually share, what we know or what didn't work, right? And what we are going to be facing in 2022. So my sense is, again, right now, still in this one is, my message is risk-taking, right? We still need, those that can afford the risk to actually make it, to actually absorb it, right? For the ones that cannot make it. And then going forward, I would say that my main point is saying, let's look at what has worked. We have good mechanisms there that are, we have something called IDA Plus, which is basically using money from, from donors to leverage the market, but then still have some money to go and make grants. So I think that there are things that we can work together. And definitely that's something that, we can get it right. What I think that we cannot afford is with so much architecture, global architecture, and so much financial innovation, we cannot make this happen again, right? We can have to avoid that, because we cannot get $2 or $3 or $4 billion in at-risk financing with that. That was actually very infamous amount of financing if you actually take into consideration the benefits for the vaccines. So to me, it's a little bit of shameful that we couldn't actually do that in the first place. And then the other thing that we say, in terms of like the sort of like how to incentivize countries to actually cooperate. Mm-hmm. I will differentiate that between high-income countries and low-income countries. Again, as I said, it's a sort of a chicken and egg. If the low-income countries and low-income countries, they don't see that the multilateral system is actually delivering for them, they will be forced to go the bilateral way, right? They will be forced to actually look for whatever is out there. So I think that what we need to really put emphasis is to make sure that that multilateral, system actually delivers. And my sense that we have the ingredients right here, right, to actually make that happen. So let me stop there. I can come back to the other questions.
Yeah, wonderful. That's a very nice overview, and certainly more than enough material for us to debate hours if we wanted to. Mark, what would be your reaction to this?
Maybe what I'll do is I'll try to talk about the first question, but I think it starts to interact with the wider financing issues that Rodrigo talked about as well. So I'll try to link to that, which is really, what have we learned from the cost-benefit and cost-effectiveness analyses that have been done of the sort of current COVID-19 vaccination effort? And my response is, the interesting thing is there haven't been a lot of these economic analyses of vaccination. There have been lots of analyses of this has been the economic impact of COVID, but when it comes to vaccination, most of the analyses have been, and most of the prioritization has been based on, okay, how many lives can we save rather than an economic dimension. But I would say that's not actually how most decisions by governments are being made, whether it's a national level prioritization or global level. Because if we were purely trying to optimize, saving as many lives as possible, then most of our countries would still be in lockdown and would continue to be, for many, many years, because that's the way we can, maximize the number of lives saved. But obviously there are other objectives. There are economic objectives. It's just that there's a bit of a disparity in the sense that maybe, the Ministry of Health sometimes will commission a, modeler to say, okay, what's the optimal strategy to save lives in terms of vaccination? And then the Ministry of Finance will say, the economy is in trouble. We need to restart the economy. And then these things don't always join up. So, and that's important on a global level too, because then we start to, get in the debate, which WHO has been having to its credit, about, okay, what are we trying to optimize? If we're really trying to optimize number of lives saved, then maybe the rich countries have a case that they should have the lion's share of vaccines because they have the oldest people who are at higher risk. But then the counter to that is the low and middle income countries. They have the weak health systems which are collapsing. They have the economies that are struggling to cope when they have pandemics, whereas the rich countries, they have a lot of spare capacity to handle these. So I think WHO has even brought ethicists and political scientists to have these discussions with it as well. And I think what's COVAX has come up with is maybe a kind of compromise in the sense that, well, both a political compromise, but also a sort of maybe a normative compromise in the sense of saying, well, let's, at least under the COVAX umbrella, let's give every country the same sort of percentage of their population will get vaccinated. So, the rich countries have a case that they have older populations. The poor countries have a case that, the health systems and the economies are struggling to cope. And actually, they are the ones who won't be able to afford to buy vaccines through bilateral deals. But I think one of the lessons learned maybe for a future pandemic is actually, it is an important question to say, okay, what is the metric that we are trying to optimize? It's not necessarily purely lives saved. Some of the ethicists in WHO have said, actually, there's no ethical basis to say that, the objective is purely to save lives without considering the life years saved. So the age of the person, because in the end, you cannot save a life forever. Everyone dies in the end. That's a fact. That's an immutable fact. So really, it's, how many years of life are you giving someone is, that is the arguments that we made. And if we, but I would say, there's an ethical dimension to that. There's a political dimension to that. There's what, governments are able to do. So in high income countries, as soon as governments see their hospitals are filled to capacity and they cannot admit patients who are needing care, they are in political trouble. So they have to address that question. In many low and middle income countries as well, there's an economic dimension of, and there are even discussions of, there are other dimensions too, like discussions of, should we vaccinate children because they need to go back to school and maybe that's the only way we can bring them back to school. So I think these are ideally conversations we need to have in advance, like before the pandemic, to say, there are a wide variety of objectives. Let's not pretend there's only one, and let's bring the stakeholders together to make sure we get them right. And let's do it not just at a country level, but if that's, if these are our priorities on a country level, then shouldn't we have the same priorities at a global level? And this then is the optimal, and ethical allocation of vaccines around the world as well. That's my,
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Mark. That's very helpful. Peter, over to you. What do you think of all these things in a joint effort? You have lots of experience by now in this field.
Let me start with the financing side of it. And it might seem a bit ironic given that my background is as a banker. But I would say I think sometimes we get a little too distracted by the precise structures, whether it's or different and the sort of the basic sort of economic truths of a response to pandemic and the basic incentives. The basic economic truth is that if you're going to have to finance something like a global vaccine rollout in response to a pandemic, that's going to be a claim on the balance sheets of the richest countries in the world.
Right.
The poorest countries in the world aren't going to afford it. And you can have lots of different ways of making those claims. You can do an IFM thing, you can do it through IDAs, you can do it through lots of things, but fundamentally, the richest countries in the world are going to have to essentially borrow some money to vaccinate the world. And sometimes I think we overcomplicate things. And actually the overcomplication, you normally get the more overcomplication, the less politically attractive the thing is to do. When you think about it, most countries in the rich countries responded to COVID with vast amounts of money for their domestic responses. They didn't use innovative tools for that at all. They just borrowed more money and made it happen really fast. You get the elaborate mechanisms when the politics of doing it is much more complicated. And the thing I think we always need to think about is when you're asking the rich countries of the world to support low and middle income countries in rolling out things like an influenza vaccine or a COVID vaccine and so on. The first thing is to say, is this in the direct interest of high income countries? Because if it is, it's going to be relatively easy to make the argument to finance it. If it's not, then the question is there a strong, in a sense, moral obligation on the rich countries of the world to help protect everybody else in the world? The reality is that becomes a lot harder to finance because that tends to be financed through ODA. It tends to, you don't open the purse strings of the Treasury quite as easily with a moral argument as you do with a direct self-interest argument. And then the third issue, and this is the one we have encountered, is quite apart from the financing, does this mean that I, in the rich countries, actually get less of whatever it is that we're actually putting out there, i.e. diagnostics or vaccines or so on? That's where it gets really difficult. Because asking rich countries to be generous on top of what they're doing already is very different from asking them to actually give up something that they too want. And so we've been treated in the COVID context to the interesting picture of some rich countries giving money for things which they then didn't make available, which is a bit of a paradox, but you can kind of understand it if you get underneath the fundamentals of what's going on here and the fundamental incentives. So I think we have to be very thoughtful as we go forward and think about these various different types of mechanisms, not to kind of kid ourselves that they will be immune to these basic realities. Because my view is that, and we've seen this in the world of finance many, many times, you create elaborate structures, but then the fundamental economic incentives are the things that drive the answer. And here again, I think in a pandemic situation, these are very powerful. We've seen the political imperatives within countries to protect your people are absolutely compelling. And it's not that they're wrong, they're very real. And if we don't think through how to design mechanisms that are kind of robust to those kinds of pressures, or that are aligned with those pressures so that we make sure that it is in people's self-interest to make these things work, then I think we're going to find that we spend a lot of time designing stuff that doesn't actually work in practice as it's meant to work in theory. I just add a small comment on some of Mark's point about this sort of the sort of prioritization of vaccination strategies and the relative impacts and things like this. I think there's some very hard questions that one starts asking when you start getting into this, because you really do have to be valuing different people's lives and the the social and economic value. But also what it will reveal if you start doing that for COVID is how incoherent we are about some of the other diseases. And to put this in sort of a real life example right now, in some of the poorest countries of the world, for example, in the Sahel in West Africa, the direct mortality of COVID is likely to be pretty low for the simple reason that the demography is, people are very young.
Very
we
young.
know, yeah. On the other hand, on the other hand, the burden of other diseases is very high. And you have a very high incidence of malaria, and you have weak health systems, which if you overwhelm them, you'll have a very high knock-on impact. And we saw that with things like Ebola. Ebola in West Africa killed more people of malaria than it did of Ebola. And I think it's quite likely that COVID-19 in places like the Sahel will do the same. And that adds a whole new complexity to the way you think about things like vaccination strategies and optimal investment strategies, because to use the economist term, your objective function isn't just number of people dying of COVID-19, it's the total impact that you're trying to minimize. And I think what if you really started being very rigorous about this, what it would show you is actually not only are there better ways of doing what we do with COVID, but we are hopelessly underinvesting, irrationally underinvesting in dealing with some of these other diseases. Very small incremental amounts of money on some of these other diseases would save a lot of lives. So, I mean, I think it's a very rich area to look at, but it's one that will open up a whole sort of can of worms once one starts looking at it. Back to you, Mark.
Yes, thank you very much, Peter. Rodrigo, I think maybe you could react a little bit on this, and let me add a dimension to it that comes out of the current discussion that we have now, is if the decision-making process, if you like, is so specifically geared towards almost a return on investment, if you like, in both individuals, groups of people, and economies, how would you see the future composition of decision-making over and beyond the global, quote, health, end of quote, decision makers? Next week, we will see the World Health Assembly coming together. And as we know, those are ministers of health. So if we want to look at the financial considerations that we have just discussed, how do we ensure, going with Peter's observation, that the rich countries have both an incentive and an obligation to play a main role here? How do you envisage a relationship with the ministers of finance or prime ministers in several countries and the ministers of health, who are traditionally not your most powerful speakers in any cabinet meeting? How to structure that in a way that would be to the benefit of, quote, literally the health of the world? Rodrigo.
Well, first, I think that Peter is totally right. I think that again, as I said, I think that at the center of any financial engineering that we make, we have to understand what are the incentives and the dynamics. And I think one thing is, I think there is a geopolitical component of all these crises that is like very important, and even more important, as important as the financial side. So I totally agree with that. I think that I have to say, I still believe that there is some things that the financial architecture can do better, right, that we have done in this time around. That's my sense. And I would say, again, the incapacity to pool risk and diversify risk, right, with all the things that, the hours that we can spend in financial engineering and having all that architecture is a little bit, striking to me. But I think that it's it is also true that there is no magic money, right? Money has to be backstopped by someone, right? It's either donors, or it's either, all countries. So I think that's totally, and I think that that should be at the center of the discussion. If anything that we learn from this one is, as we sit down and start like thinking on, and we already have to do that, right, for 2022, 2023, but still there are many issues on 2021. We have to have that at the center of it. And we have to start with that, right? And then on top of that, see what actually we need to make happen. But I think that, again, is a complementary between both things. I think in terms of we are going to be facing probably a different market, right, in 2022 and 2021. And it's also important to keep that into consideration. Supply probably is going to be unconstrained, right, depending on what the variations are. But probably we are going to be seeing, a different supply, scenario in 2022 that we have in 2021. And that is important, right? That's important because, prices are going to be different because, now, availability of vaccine is going to be different, and that is going to relax some of the constraints that we're having. That doesn't mean that the behavior of the countries is going to change, right? I mean, we are seeing this, we saw it with toilet paper, we saw it with gas in the US right now, right? It doesn't matter whether the supply is there. It's actually behavior what matters. And if you have still, high-income countries going all of a sudden, right? No matter how much supply there is, if they're all the people that have the money in the world to actually put down, vaccines orders, right? They are going, no matter what, they're going to push low-income countries behind. So I think that still those issues matter, right? No matter how unconstrained we are in the supply. Okay, you mentioned here again, what will be the discussion that needs to happen between Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Health? I think the first one is this idea that there are investments in health systems, right? That are going to actually better prepare, and this sort of dual impact, investments that we need to start like seeking, right? And this is where I think that the role of the Global Fund, for example, is extremely relevant, right? Because they have the capacity to actually put that and streamline the investments at the health system that is going to help you, right, to better, respond to the crisis. So I think one thing is, I would say, right now, one of the concerns I have personally is that there has been a lot of distraction of for good reasons, right? Diversification or diversion of investments from health system, right? Core health system investments into more short-term response. So one of the key messages I would say is like, we have to make sure that we protect the health systems investments, right? And those, I think that should be double. I mean, one of the examples I always put is Ministry of Finance have internalized very, very well, for example, in agriculture, how important it is to have data in agriculture, right? How important it is to prepare in agriculture, to have like data systems on all that, because they know how much impact in productivity those are going to have. I don't think we are quite here on health. I don't think we are quite there on health. And I hope that this is the main opportunity we have for Ministry of Finance to internalize the economic, value of investments in health, right? An investment in health systems. So if there's one message that I would say, is like, this is our opportunity, right? This has to be internalized, and this is our opportunity to bridge that gap between the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Finance, because no way you cannot see how much the impact it is, right, there is in those investments. And I think that the other point on this one is, so I think that the incentive should be there, right, for countries to prioritize, investments in health. And also I think that no matter, for good or for bad, no better opportunity than for the Ministry of Health to make that, that pitch. And I think that at the global level, I'm going to keep hammering on the same point that I made before, right? I think there has to be this sort of arrangement, as Peter was saying, right? We have to face the fact that high-income countries will need to continue bear the burden of this, right? And again, I also don't want to, let go on this one. Is I think that we need to much better, right, making sure that it's not only a matter of financing, but also a matter of diversification. So I think that point should still be in the agenda next week. I think that the other point I was going to make is that my last point on this one is, you talk to, again, the economics. I think that idea that no one is vaccinated and everyone is vaccinated is going to remain no matter what, right? And the other discussion I want to put in here, right? If I have another thing that we have not spoken about this yet, is about rollout of vaccines. We have been, a lot of focus has been done on the procurement of vaccines, right? On actually getting those and getting the orders, trying to get procurement. One of the main concerns that we have right now is that when actually the supply goes up, where those actually shipment of vaccines starting to hit countries, we don't see the preparation happening at the country level to actually get those to the right people. And that actually is equally important as it is to actually procure the vaccines. So when you see that, I think that this is an important thing rather than, right now, basically supply is constrained. So instead of like putting more orders, right, they have to be some sort of reallocation probably of prioritization in terms of making sure that countries in particular, in many cases, developing countries have the capacity to be the ones that actually ask the financing for multilaterals, right? For multilateral financing. I think that, starting to put more that emphasis on the rollout is going to be relevant. Again, that's not easy because when you don't see the vaccines hitting your airport, it's hard to manage, right? Or imagine what are the things that you're going to put in place. But I think that, looking at the dynamics of the market, the third point that I will make is that one. It's like, let's make sure that not only is about procurement, it's also about rollout and delivery. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Rodrigo. Shortly, we will turn to a few questions that are coming from the audience also. But Mark, maybe you could comment a little bit on this, the discussion we are currently having in terms of the main players to play a role in creating a setup that would better respond to future pandemics. Implicitly, we've been discussing mostly at the moment about actors in the public sector, whether it's national or international or global. Earlier today, Michael Kramer highlighted the role of incentives for industry, and that also in a mix between public and private. He mentioned the warp speed effort and actually the very positive ratios, benefit ratios that came out of that. How do you envisage the engagement in a structural fashion of the private sector and industry along these lines, not only for vaccines perhaps, but even for surveillance or in the future for ensuring the identification of influenza risks and the response to those?
That's a great question. I mean, I think essentially, COVID vaccination is, is a public initiative as much as it's a private one. Most of the manufacturers of the COVID vaccine receive public funding in a way that's never been seen before. The usual paradigm is the private manufacturers develop a vaccine. They take on the risk of bringing it to the market, conducting the trials. If it fails, they bear the risk that they lost their investment. In this case of, and then they go to the government and say, do you want to buy the vaccine that we've produced, as well as selling it in the private market? In the case of COVID vaccine, it was not even like that. The government did not only pay for the end product, they took on the risk. They basically said, we will write the check, and if the vaccine fails, so be it, because we are so desperate for this vaccine. We're willing to take on the risk and say, if your investment fails, well, we'll just lose the money. And that was a good risk to take. I think no one denies that, the billions of dollars spent on, Operation Warp Speed, similar initiatives in Europe and China and other countries, that was one of the best investments we made in 2020, really. So, but really bringing, other than one or two manufacturers that did not take public spending, you would say that it was really the public sector that brought it to market. I think the private sector, in being able to mobilize the resources to conduct the trials, to now market the vaccine, that was really important as well. So I think it was a genuine partnership. But I think that also brings the point that, well, if the public sector really played such a big role, it was actually an opportunity, really, which I think was somewhat missed. We had a good outcome. The vaccines got to the market quickly, but it was somewhat missed that there wasn't also the effort right at the start to say, okay, we're taking on the risk. We'll pay huge amounts of money for this. It will be money well spent. We're giving it to the manufacturers, but now let's think, how are we actually going to distribute it at the end with that push funding? Can we say, here's an initiative that will have to say, well, this is who will get the vaccine. It will be, based on some mechanism. This is how much it'll be priced, because basically the funding did come from the public sector. So it was an opportunity actually to then decide how do we want to pull the benefits now that we've collectivized the risks, how do we want to, distribute the collectivized benefits? And also related to that, I think, I mean, I agree with really very good comments Peter and Rodrigo made just now about the challenge Peter brought up, which is that actually on a country level, in the end, really what we're asking rich countries to do is to put altruism above their self-interest. And I think that is very true on an individual country level. If you're asking, do you want to donate 10% of your vaccines, or do you want to give some of your finances so that other countries can have the vaccine too? That is a appeal to altruism. But if we think of it on a global level, on a multi-country level, not just on an individual country level, I think there is a self-interested case also to work together, because a global optimum is better than, it's a prisoner's dilemma situation. A global optimum is better than each country's individual optimum, rather than create a situation where you vaccinated your population, but you have to stop, you have to have very tight travel restrictions, you have to keep updating the vaccine because other countries new variants will emerge and be brought to your country, you have to stop a lot of your international trade. A better optimum will be to say, how do we actually control this across the world better, so we don't have variants, so that international travel and trade can resume as much as possible. But in order for countries to see that actually they are pursuing that global optimum, they have to have confidence that there are these strong multilateral mechanisms that will enable countries of the world to work together. If they're thinking, I'm going out on my own and doing this altruistic thing, I mean, countries are not going to do that. I mean, there are lots of other examples like global warming or fishing, where one country is not incentivized to be altruistic on their own, but if countries in the world actually build these very strong multilateral mechanisms, then they can see it's to their own interest to buy into that mechanism. I think.
Yeah, wonderful, Mark. Thank you for making the ultimate question even more difficult. But we have one question from the audience, which I will put for kind of just before the end to each of us. However, in the audience, we also had a reaction to what you highlighted, Peter, asking, okay, if, let's say, what you described is the tension between addressing immediately the current pandemic, or then in future, for example, with an influenza pandemic, and then implicitly, because of it, the ultimate excess mortality in alternative, in the weakness of the health system to be able to deal with other matters, like, for example, malaria in West Africa. So if you follow that argument, the question from the audience is, how do you deal with that? How do you, is there somewhere a tripping point that you say, okay, in this country, the other health issues are so big, we'll forget about the pandemic issue here, and we redirect the resources? How would you manage that, Peter?
It's a really good question, and I don't think there is a simple answer, because the burden of disease isn't equally distributed across the world. In some places, you have a very high burden of malaria. In other places, you might have a very high burden of tuberculosis. And the interaction between these infectious diseases and the new ones, either COVID or future pathogens, is very complex. I suspect quite a lot of the people who are tragically dying of COVID in India at the moment are also infected with TB. India has the highest TB prevalence in the world, in number of people with TB in the world. And TB does make you more vulnerable to severe cases of COVID. So what killed you? Was it TB or COVID, or was it the combination? My fundamental view is that we need to think about this in terms of protecting people from the biggest infectious diseases and the deadliest infectious diseases, whether they happen to be the ones which are in a sense, the old pandemics, because the reality is TB was a pandemic. It was the biggest killer in many parts of the world for many, many years. HIV was the most recent pandemic of scale to hit humanity. Malaria is the oldest, right? Malaria was a pandemic back into the millennia, but we still haven't finished with them. And my view, and this comes a bit to Rodrigo's point about kind of dual use, is that the things you do to fight big infectious diseases that are in front of you tend to be very similar, if not exactly the same, as the things you do to fight the infectious diseases that are just around the corner. And so that the more you can be smartly both delivering benefits against the diseases that are facing you, be it COVID, be it malaria, be it TB, but do it in a way that also reinforces your protection against the next potential pathogens, then that strikes me as a very sensible thing to do for a number of reasons. One is you're building pandemic protection on a marginal basis as opposed to a discrete thing. Secondly, also, you're providing an incentive for people to stay interested. The perennial problem with pandemic preparedness is that it's really hard to keep people interested in something where success is measured by nothing happening. Whereas if at the same time, you're actually reducing the death toll from other diseases, making people have safer from these other diseases, and you're building pandemic preparedness, that's an easier sell from a kind of finance ministry and sustainability perspective. So I don't think there is a precise equation that is going to be exactly the same in every country. But I think this notion that we should be thinking in terms of both the diseases we've got, the infectious diseases we've got, and the infectious diseases that might hit us, and what are the things that you can do that help protect people from both, that to my mind is where there's a really powerful synergy.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I think that's very helpful also for the clarification of many of our participants in the audience. Rodrigo, from the point of where you sit, how would you look at that? What Peter and Mark just describes then kind of begs the question, oh, okay, do we simply go ahead and then strengthen the agencies that we have, or the instruments that we have, like WHO and the Global Fund and UNICEF and the IHR? We simply go back and we make that stronger, and then mix that with the argument of finance, which seems always the kind of default. No, we need more money. Well, just imagine that based on the current experience, we actually do have the resources. You are in a very particular nice position in a kind of a separate world, but there are more and more foundations like yours that play a significant role. How would you look at that?
Look, great question. I think, obviously I try to resist the temptation to create new things that are unfunded, right? When we have so many good, super strong institutions already there, right? So I think that, as Peter was saying, looking at the Global Fund, right? Well, again, super efficient, right? A proven mechanism, right? Very successful. You can, on top of that, right, really synergize a lot of the investments that we are discussing right now. Great praise by, the most important thing also is country demand, right? And how these things are seen from the countries. And again, countries really praise the Global Fund, for example, because the trust they have been able to build, right? And I think that, if you put that to me, that versus let's create a new thing that is going to consume $10 billion of grant financing that who knows how we're going to get. And frankly, perhaps we get them today when we still need to finance, frankly, the vaccine procurement and COVAX and the old things. Divert that money that could be actually very important, right? And then, who knows we're going to get the money next year, right? Because people, they have like short memories. I think it might be an issue of efficiency there, right? So if you ask me, and this is coming back to my previous point at the beginning, this is where efficient allocation of resources start to matter, right? Saying, what are you going to be doing with that money, right? If you, for example, you're thinking about launching a global bond, vaccine bond, right? Okay, what do you need for that? I need to get money from donors to actually securitize that thing, right? but what I'm going to get out of the bonds is actually debt. So I need to be very clear on the substitution effects that we are having here, right? Where we think the donor money, which is super scarce, and it's at the core of this. I think Mark and both Peter said, this is a public thing, a public health, right? We can talk about private sector financing and everything, but that is going to be, not the core here, right? The core is going to continue to be public financing. We need to be very clear on what the trade-offs and the opportunity costs are. So if you ask me, I think that to me is more strengthen the institution that we have. I think we still need to do more better coordination, right? And build those incentives. I think there is some way to go to work together with countries and, accompany them and see, meet them where they are, right? But I think that would be my tendency. And the other thing, as I said, is even across the things that we see from, multilateral financing, bilateral, I think there is still some improvements that we can make, right? But let's make sure that we don't compare apples with oranges, right? People say we're magically going to create $20 billion and we're going to actually put it. No, that's not the case. If you are going to go to the market is going to ask you to pay back that money, right? So, I'm going to be very clear on these things because sometimes we tend to believe even SDRs or the special drawing rights from the IMF, that actually is still debt. So I just, finishing with this because it's important when we put everything one by one, right? We are really clear. And if you ask me where the money donors should be putting the money, probably we have in front of us a lot of good institutions that actually are very, very effective.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Rodrigo. That's a clear response to that. I think we have 9 minutes left. And now I'm getting to that earlier question from the audience, which was thoughtful and probably reflective of many around the world involved with any of the pandemic response or activities that we are undertaking, is we have, as is reflective from this discussion, so many issues in front of us. Right? We look at the working groups just of today and the One Health and then the financing and the technical stuff and the surveillance, and there are so many of these things going on if we look at the various reports that have come out so far. So the question is, if you were to pick the one or two most important elements that we really should put priority on, what would be your choice? Mark, maybe we'll start with you.
Okay, that's a really good but challenging question. I mean, part of me wants to say they're all important. I mean, I think one thing we've learned from COVID is, I mean, the human beings and the world has an incredible capacity to get the technical, the science part right. I mean, the way the vaccines have been developed in 12 months when we said it takes 10 years to bring a vaccine to the market, the way we've worked out, there are some, ways to treat COVID, which decrease the fatality rate by 30%, 40% within a few months of knowing the virus emerging. The science has been incredible, and the world has always, I think, I applaud the scientists, but the world has always delivered on the science. It's the part that the world is not so good at delivering is actually the politics that can bring the science to do the most good in the world. But because I'm not a politician or political scientist, I don't know what the solution is for that. But I would say that is always the most important part when it comes to global health crisis.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Mark. How would you look at that question, Peter?
A couple of things. First is we need to deal with the problem we got in front of us, because the harsh truth is that we're in a race against a rapidly evolving virus, and it's not clear that we're winning. If you actually look at the true death toll, not the reported death toll, but the true death toll across the world, we're at a pretty grim place in terms of the fight against COVID-19. So first thing is we got to deal with this. And this is one of these situations actually where a cost-benefit analysis is kind of irrelevant because the benefits are so huge that the limiting factor of how much money we could spend is not the money, it's how we could actually do it. And we should be mobilized as a world to beat this pandemic as quickly as possible. The second thing we need to do is we need to break the habit we have of losing interest in pandemics when they stop killing people in rich countries. I'm afraid to say there is, the diseases I deal with, HIV, TB, they were all pandemics. It's just that when they stopped killing people in rich countries, we didn't have quite the same intensity of focus. We should not do that with COVID. We should finish the job. But while we're about it, we should finish the job with the earlier diseases, the earlier pandemics as well. And if we want the world as a whole to think differently about the threat of infectious diseases, we can't have a definition of pandemics which is sort of written in brackets only when it's killing people in rich countries. That's just not going to work. So my two things are, first, we need to deal with COVID-19 as aggressively and comprehensively as possible and as fast as possible. And secondly, we need to reframe the way we think about pandemics and global health security so it really is inclusive, that the definition of the problem is inclusive, and that we're making everyone safer from the deadliest infectious diseases.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Peter. Final word to you, Rodrigo, before we kind of end.
I don't want to come on final word after Peter, but I think, to me, it's a little bit to get a double click on what Peter said. I think that, we have to deal with the problem in front of us. I think I said before, there's an issue on delivery and rollout that we are not looking that closely. And I think that's an important part of it, getting countries ready, right? Because again, if you look at the numbers of COVAX, we're going to go to 20 to 200 in the next 3 or 4 months, right? And that when those things start hitting the airport is a big issue, right? I think institutions, like, they are already working on that. They will be our front line of defense, right? And first line of defense. And I think, as I said, this is not a matter of countries not knowing. It's actually they don't know what is coming, right? So it's important that sort of, making sure that it's a sort of like demand also incentivize the demand, but also inform that demand, right? Which I think is relevant. And I think the second one, I totally agree with Peter. I think that, we need to get both the what and the how right? The what is pretty straightforward in my mind. I mean, it's kind of a no-brainer what we need to do. Yes, we have issues around, country level preparedness and response. We have surveillance. I think that the most problematic thing, frankly, is preparedness, right? So bringing those into the more steady flows of investments that countries are going to be making, is important. That has to have some sort of programming from the institutions that are actually doing that work. And I think that, again, I'm a financial guy, so I think that financing is going to matter, right? So I think that there are things that without rocket science financing, we have to put 2 + 2 and actually be very simple saying, these are the things that we think are going to actually matter in terms of putting these together. It's not rocket science. We know what is actually going to be needed and how to do it. The most critical thing, I think, is the geopolitics here, right? I'm going to put, like Mark, say that I know the political science, but I think that we need more political scientists in this discussion to help us, disentangle, the dynamics.
Wonderful, Rodrigo. I think that's a nice conclusion of our discussion. I think it also nicely resonates with the report of the independent panel that we saw earlier this week or last week, which highlighted the unfortunate absence of global political leadership in this field. So with that, I thank the audience for your interest and the nice questions that we got. I thank the participants and our panelists, Rodrigo, Mark, Peter. I think a very wonderful discussion, and I'll hand it back to either Joanna or those who are running the current first day. For those in the audience that are interested in participating in day 2 and 3, I may remind them that a similar interesting program is coming up coming Friday and next week, Monday or Tuesday, I think, Joanna, right?
Correct. This Friday and next Tuesday.
Yeah. Thank you very much.